Good evening, everyone. I'm Larry Hurtado, professor of New Testament and head of the School of Divinity, and I'm a member of the Gifford Lectures Committee. It's my honor and privilege to introduce this final lecture in this year's Gifford series by Professor Michael Gazzaniga from University of California at Santa Barbara. The series this year on Free, the Science of Mind Constraining Matter, and this evening's lecture, as you see before you here, is We Are the Law. I want you to join me in welcoming Professor Gazzaniga to the lectern.
Thank you, and thank you, Hearty Souls, for to the last lecture. There is a reception afterwards, so I know your motivation. This We Are the Law was suggested to me by a philosopher, Gary Watson, pointing out the simple fact that as we come to think of ourselves, we shape the rules by which we decide to live by. And so if we begin to think of ourselves differently than we had 50, 100, 200 years ago, obviously we're going to construct the social framework around us differently. And that comes down to the fact we are the law. And the reason that's important in my context is that as I try to look into the issues of neuroscience and how brain enables mind, are we becoming of a different belief about the nature of man, about what we are, and about how we should interact? And in doing so, is our legal structure going to change? So again, my quick review from the past lecture, The Mind Constrains the Brain, Understanding How Social Process Constrains Individual Minds. Tonight, the idea is to talk about cultural impact on law and our views of responsibility and justice that emerge out of neuroscience view of the human condition. Is retribution necessary or only accountability? And finally, is punishment justified? These are the issues that I can tell you right now are not in any way answered, but they're brought to the fore by research on the brain and what it tells us about who we are. So first of all, the cultural effects on cognitive processes are real. Culture plays a significant role in shaping cognitive processes, and I'm going to show you an example of that. And so consequently, we should consider what's called a niche construction dynamics, which is attempting to characterize the system formed by the human brain, mind, and cultural interactions, how we come into this cognitive niche and how we change our environment and how that influences us. So first of all, just an example of how a different cultural experience can actually change not only cognitive processes, but also the underlying physiology. This simple picture here of a fish tank is shown to people from East Asia. This is work done by the very talented psychologist Richard Nisbett. And Americans, when they're shown this fish tank, notice the fish, the big fish. If you show the same picture to Asian viewers attend to the entire scene. They look at it, all of it, the scene and its relative relationships. And so you can detect this by their descriptions of the scene. If when you ask them after you flash it, what did you see? You can detect it in various memory tests. In short, Americans, when they look at something, view the scene completely different from Asians, and of course this is a cultural effect. But can it impact in any way the brain? So the notion that this has been interpreted is, how it's been interpreted is individualism of America stands in stark contrast to sense of interdependence in East Asian countries. And so the question is, okay, can you pick that up in a brain analysis? And Hayden Gabrielli recently did exactly that and did variations of that test that searched for independence and independence and interdependence. And they find out that when Americans are doing the interdependent, trying to see how something is to be understood in relative terms, their brain is working really hard. But when they're looking at it for just picking out the independent view. It's hardly working at all, and just the opposite for Asian culture. So it's powerful to see that it has an impact, and it can actually be read not only in the behavior and cognitive stance of somebody, but also in the underlying physiology. So as I said, this gives rise to this idea of and strengthening the importance of this idea of niche construction. In the standard Darwinian model, you have elements being influenced by the environment, and the normal natural selection processes we all know about occur as we adapt to the strongest entities survive a particular environment. But when you get into what's called niche construction, where the element, namely us, the human, can actually change the environment, then you start getting this interaction between the ability of the organism to change the environment and that feeding back and selecting the people that in fact are changing the environment. So, this comes particularly important, these ideas, when you begin to think about how legal structures, about how our moral rules might impact. So what we're saying is that a society develops an aggregate of moral rules, that there's a societal robustness constraint, if you will, and those social pressures actually affect the underlying brain. And so you see how culture impacts development and evolution of neurocircuitry. You can see how this thing over time begins to shape actually who we are. So these moral systems and understanding them become real, and they become important, very important to understand. So we're going to apply that general principle, that general concept to the question before the House, which is we think about justice and punishment. And I'm going to show you an event in American history that will get us to the essential problem.
This version tracks the limousine and maintains President Kennedy and Governor Connally at center frame. This version is only in slow motion.
I won't show the rest. It's too upsetting for... just out of curiosity, how many people in the room remember that? Wow, amazing. Americans and the world were reacted with horror with that, and all kinds of reactions. And it wasn't long before Americans took care of that problem. It was the next day that Jack Ruby fulfilled the retributive moment and carried out the assassination of Lee Harvey Oswald. So in that case, the question becomes, who do we blame, the person or the brain? Who do we blame in a crime? If we've come all this way through these lectures and been talking about all this determinism, do we come to think of the fact that maybe, we want to hold the person accountable, but we want to forgive him because of this deterministic dimension? And but as everybody knows, the law is very complicated, and there's other cases, not sheer intentional murder as in the Kennedy case, but this case is of interest from Australia, where a man goes into a liquor store or market, I forget what it was, to hold it up, and he has a loaded gun, and he asks the guy for the money, and the guy gives it to him, no problem there. And then sort of as he's on the way out or something, he trips and the gun accidentally goes off and kills the guy. And so his defense was that it was a reflex action, it wasn't intentional, no intentional wound, shouldn't he be not charged with murder, it's simply manslaughter. And so these issues are everywhere, and they're everywhere in every court in America and in obviously the UK with common law. And it's interesting to think that the court system itself, the trial, the jury, where we think these things are battled out, it's certainly true, but on the other hand, very few of all criminal cases, as you know, actually go to trial. They're all plea bargained out and settled out of court. But what happens is that if you start to think now of what does go on in the courtroom, this laboratory of judicial thinking, what does go on there, this is a place where neuroscience has an enormous amount to say. Everything from the question of diminished responsibility in a defendant, everything from whether a judge in some way, and I'm going to show you cases where a judge might be biased by the very nature of the proceedings going on, and though he's unconscious of the fact he's being biased, the reliability of witness testimony, bias in the jury, and the representation of the facts by the prosecutor, all these things, lie detection, everything, all these things now have a neuroscience dimension, and they're being suggested that neuroscience is going to come in and impact how all these processes go forward. And so with that in mind, to some extent, Robert Sapolsky, a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University, proposed or made this statement that he said, it's boggling that the legal system's gold standard for an insanity defense, McNaughton, right here in Scotland, is based on 166-year-old science. Our growing knowledge about the brain makes notions of volition, culpability, and ultimately the very premise of a criminal justice system deeply suspect. Well, that's an extremely strong statement, but what he's actually saying is that given this feeling of determinism, given this feeling that we're beginning to understand mental states, given we can actually, as I'll show you, track down which parts of the brain are involved in volitional activity, and given they may be impaired, as we grow in our knowledge of that and become very specific about it, aren't we going to view how we view a defendant much differently? So that is the large picture of a project that I'm involved in neuroscience and the law. There are people, however, who make sobering observations about the chutzpah of neuroscientists. Alvin Oh, a very bright young philosopher at Berkeley, points out, he says, I mentioned before that it is over-optimistic to think of the new neuroscience of consciousness as in its infancy. Developmentally, it would be more apt to characterize it like a teenager. Like teenagers, neuroscience is in the grip of technology. It has a grandiose sense of its own abilities, and is entirely lacking a sense of history of where, what, for it seems so new and exciting. So he needs to calm down a little bit. We're not completely that uninformed. So what's at stake here? Determinism and the law. So what's at stake? Here's what's at stake. Does modern neuroscience deepen our ideas about determinism, and with more determinism, is there less reason for retribution and punishment? That's the $64 question. And to put it differently, with determinism, there is no blame, and with no blame, there should be no retribution and punishment, is the idea that's around, that's about, that people are worried about and puzzled about. And how do we go after that? Well, and it's important, as I said from the beginning, because if we change our minds about these things as a culture, as a society, we're going to change how we deal with this whole unfortunate aspect of human behavior of crime and punishment. So we go back to our common roots in the common law system, and just think when a lot of traditions were developed, there wasn't much science around to consider. And if you move up to 1950, there's a slow introduction of science, but it's interesting to consider the 1950 jury, what they called science, psychoanalytic theory. So if they would bring in the expert, the professional, and coming into the courtroom to testify one way or the other was in fact a psychiatrist talking about the analysis of someone's behavior from a psychoanalytic point of view. Well, we've come a long way, and in 2009, we're asking ourselves the question that, well, now that we know all these brain mechanisms, correlates of cognitive states and mental stance and what have you, is it too much? Are scans, in fact, brain scans, when they're brought into the courtroom, and they are brought in, and they try to be brought in more frequently, the question that you want to know is, are those scans more probative, or are they actually prejudicial? Is there something about our culture that actually believes more about the science of these scans than the scientists who produce it? And it's been called that the neuroscience of determinism has sort of oozed into the public consciousness. So whether we can go through vast intellectual debates about where we stand on this matter of determinism, But in fact, everybody kind of thinks it's a scientific world, and the scientist walks in and shows the scan and shows a hole in the head and says, that's the reason why Jones should be considered not guilty of this, and so forth. And so the question is there too much science now and not used properly? Getting to the bottom of that and establishing those facts is hugely important. Another one of these studies that shows how we think of ourselves and how that impacts was just recently carried out again by Sheriff Josh Green and my colleague Jonathan Schooler, where again they're playing again. The students are about to play a game where they are going to administer greater or lesser punishment to somebody, and they are first primed, as it were, by reading a book that is very deterministic in nature or not. And for those who read the book about determinism, they administer less punishment than those that don't. So how we come to believe about this thing, about these issues, about the nature of ourselves, is going to, I think, influence who we are. So the first issue then on this neuroscience and law question is we're going to look at determinism and exculpability. And we, of course, looked at, in Lecture 4, we looked at the march towards determinism as it comes from neuroscience, and we don't have to go through that again. And you take that into the legal framework, here's the situation. Basically, law looks at the brain in this simple pattern. There's a practical reasoner that is working freely in a normal brain, producing action and behavior. That's the practical reasoner model of anybody, of humans. And then, so personal responsibility is a product of a normally functioning brain, is sort of the setup for how these matters are considered now. And so something occurs to the brain, a lesion, an injury, a stroke, or a neurotransmitter disorder, whatever it is, that makes the brain not function normally. And there's many, many examples of this. A classic case in the United States is the case of Simon Perella, who in 1982, a judge sentenced to death for what's called what is first-degree murder. And 21 years later, after fighting it through the courts and everything, he was picked up by a set of lawyers who didn't believe the charge. I thought there were other circumstances. A brain scan was the evidence that essentially was offered as to why he should be excused from this crime, and in fact, ultimately, he was. So it was evidence that a brain scan can have a powerful effect on the outcome of justice. And of course, in the famous Reagan situation, I just found this video very, very interesting. I'll see how many of you remember this.
25 years, it remains a moment seared in history. The attempted assassination of President Reagan in March 1981. This rare, unedited video of the shooting captures the...
So, you would think the Americans have a problem with this, given the two samples I've given you, but that's just the history. Anyway, John Hinckley, who was obviously the murderer, or the attempted assassin there, in fact had dilated ventricles, and in fact a case was made by a Harvard psychiatrist that he was demonstrably schizophrenic based on this physical evidence. It didn't get into the actual decisions, so quite deep into the process. But again, it was an evidence that you can have a diminished brain and use it as a reason for exculpability. So the problem with that story, the simple brain disruption story, the brain injury story, the neurotransmitter story, can be seen in a number of ways. In schizophrenia, of course, there are abnormal neurotransmitters, and there's a higher incidence of arrest, usually drug-related amongst schizophrenics. But there's no higher incidence of violent behavior in schizophrenics who are maintained on their medication, and there's a slight increase of violent behavior on ones who are not, but it's a very low number. And so here's a situation where just because you're going to use the defense of schizophrenia because it helps you in one case, it also improperly liberates you from another case. And it isn't the case that if you have schizophrenia, that you all of a sudden your base rate of violent behavior goes up and you're vastly more likely to commit a crime. And the same is true. So the brain has no area of network for responsibility is what you get out of that. And another classic sort of thing are the left frontal lobe lesions. This is the famous Phineas Gage lesion that made him violent or increased his violence. And there's no question that people with left frontal lobe lesions can become clinically odd. Their family and spouse know it, the patient can note it. Yet, if you look at the increase of their incidence of violent behavior, it goes from the normal base rate of about 3% in our culture up to 11%. Nothing's a switch. Nothing just, if you make a lesion in the brain, you just switch on violence. So you can't just take these cases and say, oh, because it occurs in one case, you can't generalize it out to another. If it was concluded that people with left frontal lobe lesions were going to be made exculpable for their behavior, you could imagine people with left frontal lobe lesions saying, you know, I have a built-in excuse to carry out a few revenges that I want to do, and I will get off scot-free. So you got to be very careful. It can flip on you, and it can be used in an inappropriate way. So the question here, the brain really has no area or network of responsibility. And as we've said before, the area of responsibility, the way to think about responsibility is in the culture and the interactions between people, not in the brain. But brain images are very prevalent. They're in the courtroom, and they have to be dealt with. And so, and why? Well, rethinking fMRI is what we're going to do, but first of all, its claim, functional brain imaging is the basis of the growing tendency to think of the brain in deterministic terms. There's no question about that. It seems inevitable that the findings of functional brain imaging examinations will be introduced as evidence in legal proceedings. There's absolutely no question about that. However, the question is, closer inspection of the technique really casts doubt on these interpretations and expectation. I just want to mention these in passing because it's very important to understand this. And let's call it it's the problem of individual variation. That everybody's brain in this room probably is slightly different, and it reliably solves problems in different ways. And one can see this fact. I mean, there's a rich history of individual variations, and people have known about this in psychology for years, of course. But in the brain imaging environment, it sort of disappeared for a while, because in order to start brain imaging, one had to get the signal-to-noise ratio in a particular study up. So what they would do is they would study 20 people in the scanner, then they'd get a way of morphing their brain into one space, and then they would add together all the variables, all the numbers into that morphed averaged brain in order to get their signal-to-noise ratio high enough to say that they got a particular response. And this was done by the great French radiologist Jean Tillerac. And this, actually the brain he picked was an 80-year-old French woman. And so much of early brain research was built around that. The problem is, though, that if most of the brain imaging work is coming from groups, how do you get to the individual? How do you get to Jones, who's the defendant, in the courtroom? If you're talking about all your science in terms of groups, it's a huge problem. And I don't need that. So let me show you the exact examples. So here's how it works. Here would be an average result. So this is a brain response to a recognition memory test, and this is a group of, I think, 16 subjects altogether being averaged together to give you that response. So people might say, if they weren't careful, they would say, well, the left frontal areas are heavily involved in this particular kind of memory task. Okay, but wait a minute. Let's look at all of the people in that experiment. And, well, there's a subject, he doesn't have that same area. Well, let's look at them all. these are the first 9 subjects. And you see the areas where there is activity in the summed average, but all these other patients, all these other, so these aren't patients, all these other subjects simply do not have activation in that area. So how could you take a claim of a particular person and compare it to this average and think you have a story to unwind in terms of the underlying neuroscience of a particular mental state? And what's interesting is that if you bring each of these subjects back 6 months later, so I bring Jones back 6 months later, the pattern of responses that he has on a particular task are very closely related. So he or she are consistent in how they respond to a particular challenge, but the variation between the people remains high. So bringing neuroscience into the courtroom has that danger. How are you going to actually take group data, which so much of these studies really reflect, how are you going to actually apply it to a particular individual? And that's only one problem. We've been talking over the last few weeks, it seems like that, about variations in white matter, the connection, the fibers that connect these areas of activity. And you must understand the human is nothing but you always hear about the gray matter, but we are massive wires and connections. And if you look at an MR scan in cross-section, you see the vast amount of fiber connections that we're composed of. And you look at a rat, and it's very, very little, a very small amount of white matter. So it's very important how our connections are made from one place to another. And it turns out we can now study those, as I mentioned, using this technique called diffusion tensor imaging, where we can actually follow the tracks in the human brain. And what's interesting is you can now look for individual variations. So maybe the way your corpus callosum is hooked up from one person to another is quite different. And this was first made evident to us by work carried out in our lab, where we were calling upon 2 processes. A process that we knew was present in the right hemisphere that takes an object and rotates it in space, and then a left hemisphere process that then names the objects. So if you show a boat to the subject and it's upside down, before you could name it, what you do is sort of rotate it in your mind, and then you send that rotated image over to the left hemisphere, and the left hemisphere applies the name and out. Well, what we noticed was that there were people fast at this, people slow at this. And we were able to track out the fast people transferred the information in one part of their brain, one part of their callosum, and the slow people used a totally different mechanism to get the information over to the speech center. So then that raised the question, well, maybe there's actual anatomical differences that reflect why different routes are taken, why somebody may be a little bit faster or slower on a particular task. And so working with Carl Doran in the lab, we have taken subjects and we've studied how the callosum connections vary to these areas in the lateral surface of the cortex. And you basically take the subjects and you find out, these are 4 subjects, that the amount of fibers in the callosum varies tremendously for a particular region from subject to subject to subject. And in this one subject here, a totally different route is taken to get over to the other hemisphere. These are just normal folks being studied, and we can now study it, and we see this individual variation. So the task, when you look at this in the legal concept, is how are you going to capture all of this variation when you're talking about using brain scans against or for a particular person in a legal setting. So the case against Ganz in the courtroom now is, I think, fairly firm and reasonable, and I don't think too many people disagree with it. And what are they? Just to summarize them quickly, the mind, emotions, and the way we think constantly change. What is measured in the brain at the time of scanning doesn't reflect what was happening at the time of a crime. So I'm going to bring you in to test you out today, but you committed the crime last week. How do you put that story together? It's not a good idea. All brains are different from each other. That's the point I just made. Brains are sensitive to many factors that can change the scans: caffeine, tobacco, alcohol, fatigue, strategy, you name it. And performance is not consistent. People do better or worse at the task from day to day. Images of the brain are prejudicial. A picture creates about what we've already been there. So there's a lot of reasons why today, now, 2009, while this science is enormously promising, there's real firm reasons why it probably will more likely than not be misused in a courtroom instead of being used properly. But what you have to remember is, as soon as I do that, what you have to remember is that's today. And what you know, if you are a practicing scientist, is things change. They change fast, they change quickly, and things are coming that are going to change all of that. So what you have to do is get ready for tomorrow. And tomorrow, there's going to be by tomorrow, I mean 10 years, 15 years. You can't predict it because somebody will come up with something and there'll be an exponential growth in the understanding of how a particular scientific view can be applied to a larger question. And let me just give you a clue about how and what may be coming. We'll go back first to the foundation of Sir Edward Coke's maxim, which is central to American and British common law, the actus non facit rois nisi mens sit rea, better known as mens rea. I just put it down there for the fun, trying to translate it. Moving through not the making, defended if not mind, he is rea. Remember when you used to translate Latin sitting in your desk upstairs and everybody else was watching television and it made no sense to you then? Well, you were right. It makes no sense. The act does not make a person guilty unless the mind is guilty. You need a guilty mind to be guilty of a crime. Everybody knows. And there's four major parts. You have to either demonstrate purposefulness, you have to demonstrate knowledge, you have to demonstrate recklessness, you have to demonstrate negligence. Now, guess what? Each of those issues have brain mechanisms that are well studied and are being better studied and better understood each year we go along. So purposefulness involves intentional systems. Knowledge and awareness involves emotional systems. Recklessness and lack of it, or creation of it, involves reward systems. Negligence and the creation of a substantial or known risk involves joy seeking. Each of these ways of saying the other are large areas of research in neuroscience for which much is known. And I wanted to just tell you about one, the one that would me at some level seem less likely, but in fact it is true. If you take, this is recent work by Desmerget, and it's fascinating. If you take normal folks and you stimulate, actually these are normal folks with their skulls on. This is a pictorial representation of it using that stimulating device we talked about earlier. But here's his astounding discovery, that if you stimulate in the right parietal area at a low rate, you have the subject has a sensation that he has a conscious attention. If you stimulate in these areas, and there may be a difference here between the red and yellow, it's in the parietal lobe. If you stimulate at a higher rate, there's awareness of action despite the absence of muscle. In other words, the person is sitting there and he or she is convinced that they've just carried out an act and they haven't done anything yet. So there's an attention, there's the belief of awareness of action, but even more strangely, if you stimulate in the frontal areas, the subject produces a multi-joint movement, but the subject remains unaware of it. So you can break these things apart. You can see particular brain areas that are going to be involved in particular acts of what you think is a willed activity. And as the as the neurologic scanning comes in and says, well, look at Jones has a lesion here. His ability to form an intent is totally disrupted, or what have you. Anyway, along the train from intention to motor act, there's going to be a story one can tell about whether the person is functioning normally or not. And this work is also attention to intention areas was nicely demonstrated by the young cognitive neuroscientists at Cambridge, now Columbia Law, and we mentioned this work briefly the other day. So this is what's coming. There's going to be mental states, mens rea mental states are very important in determining guilt or innocence, and there's going to be claims coming down the pike which are going to be tighter than what can be currently stated today on these fronts, and that, I think, will have an enormous influence on how we think about ourselves and how the law will deal with it. So another area of practical, more practical nature is of interest. The problem of bias in the courtroom is a big concern, and Supreme Court Justice Arthur Kennedy observed, the law makes a promise, neutrality. If the promise gets broken, the law as we know it ceases to exist. It's obviously true. And the question is, how much of it's sneaking in unbeknownst to people involved in the judicial process? Are judges being manipulated by things they don't even think are manipulating them? They know when they're being manipulated by the attorneys, or trying to be manipulated. But about other more subtle approaches. So one example of this comes from, if you remember the Duke lacrosse case several years ago, where Duke students were accused of sexual activities with a couple of women, and there was deep problems about it. And well, it turns out it was a problem probably of eyewitness bias that arises out of something that is well known in psychology called own race bias memory. So people of one race are very good at detecting differences in facial features of their race, and they're very poor at detecting people of another race. And this does, so black versus white, Asian versus black, black versus Asians, every God, all of a sudden the races of the world got departed in my head. So whatever it is, we are very good in practice at our own, and this has been used in the courts for years at a behavioral level. But along comes a young colleague of mine, David Turk, who now is at Aberdeen, and he demonstrates that this own race bias phenomenon is localized to processes in the right brain. So now that it has a neurologic meat on it, as it were, it becomes a very powerful tool to be used. And I think this is another example of how neuroscience will impact the nature of evidence, which will ultimately impact the law. But more interesting on this bias question, work done at Princeton by Susan Fisk in her lab really is telling. What she did basically was study normal undergraduates on a series of people having a particular emotional state. And it turns out that if you study people that faces that depict, that elicit the emotion in you of pity, there's a certain brain activity pattern. If you study people that are eliciting pride in you from the way she sets up the experiment, there's another sort of brain activity profile. If you study envy, there's still another network that seems to be activated under that. But then you throw up in that story someone that elicits the emotion of disgust, and in particular examples to say a drug addict. There's a reaction of disgust, and the brain activities are totally different. And they're no different than when you look at a rock, an inanimate object. So what happens is that we have somehow taken this defendant, knowing his crime, you look at him, and you're not doing this consciously, but you're having a totally different simulated response to that person. And how can that not powerfully influence you and potentially change how you're going to evaluate that person in punishment. So that's all. That's all getting the person, the issues that get the person charged, and basically people get charged and are proven guilty. They are the agents of the crime, and that's kind of the easy part. It's been pointed out to me by justice after justice. All of what really is going on goes on in the sentencing phase of a trial, where you're trying to look at all the factors that may be mitigating the person's act. I mean, Jones did rob the store, did kill the person. We know that. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to treat Jones with relationships to everything we know? And so the Mother Justice brings at this point in all the issues that we know about in ethics and rationality, law, natural law, fairness, religion, and so forth. And again, I say it's at the sentencing and mitigation issue. So if you have a belief that people are personally responsible, then you have an understanding why retribution seems appropriate, and punishment as well. If, on the other hand, you have this determinism view, and what you're really concerned about is accountability is probably all that really matters. You're thinking to yourself, and out of that can grow some kind of forgiveness. These are tensions that go on, as you'll see, every day up until this week's Scotsman. I'm going to give you a couple of examples locally for the fun of it. But it is obviously a tension that is with us. And it comes early. In fact, apparently we're born with it again. You know, I mean, people, the developmental psychologists, constantly are taking human activities that we think we've learned and honed and developed and sent off to school and learned all the details about, and then they, wiggle a couple of things in front of babies and find out, the baby's already got it, and all we've been doing is adding, ornaments to it and tinsels and everything. And so here, I mean, innate infants and fairness. This is the work of very talented psychologist René Balageron, and again, working with David Premack, who we've talked so much about. So here's one experiment that shows that babies right away have young babies, these are a few months old, have a sense of fairness. So if you take let's see how I got this working here. If you take little giraffes that are animated, they're puppets as you see there, and baby is supposed to divide up the goods. So if a banana goes to this giraffe, the baby is only happy if a banana goes to the other giraffe. Okay, they have to, and they do various tricks of how they measure the baby. But the basic idea is that things have to be distributed equally to this animate object. And psychologists are always running controls, so they put up two giraffes that in fact aren't animated. They're plastic, stiff things there. They look inanimate. They don't elicit in the baby this whole sense of social response. And under that case, the baby could care less where you put the bananas. So right off the bat, you got a fairness mechanism going in young children. But now, what about reciprocity? Well, they've tested up down to 18 months, and reciprocity is alive and well right from the beginning. So I've illustrated, I went a little crazy on this, just bear with me. The first act is babies are watching this, and A steals B's cookie. Okay, that's a little much. But babies not surprised if B steals it back. They're just not surprised. I'm just trying to completely use everything Microsoft PowerPoint has throughout the course of this lecture. But there it is, that the babies aren't surprised. A hits B, another way to say it. A hits B, okay. B is not surprised, the baby is not surprised that B whacks A. It's surprised that B doesn't do anything about it. Here's a deeper one. the relationship extends to group. So if A hinders B, all right, hinders B, now babies are surprised if C helps A, right? What are you helping him for? The guy hit, not only hit hit B, he hit the group, and you're part of the group. What are you going over there and helping A for? So in response to that, babies are totally surprised. Retributive from the beginning, again. A hits B. Babies are not surprised, as I said, if B hits A. Absolutely not surprised. So there you go. So all these things that are playing out in us, and we feel them all the time, and we're having these polls, and we're trying to have big theories about it. It's just, apparently it's how we're built. So a colleague, a young fellow worked with us on this project, was a person who was not a retributivist and was very upset by our legal system and its punishment. And but he was going to study it scientifically, and he decided to go off to the New Mexico prison and to do some studies. And so for the first time in his life, he was actually in a cell with a man who had harmed a child, killed the principal of a school, just a bad news guy, right? And he was sitting, right there, and he was there, and he was in his orange suit, and he says, he'd been a practiced pacifist, and he just said he just felt, just the retributive thought coming up in his head, and it raises the question. So no one seems to argue too much that there is this retributive response. And the question is, why is it tied into us like that? Well, in evolutionary time, when we're having to deal with our social groups and someone acts antisocially, there wasn't a jail down the street to go put the person in, right? So you probably had to carry out a violent act to deal with the matter. And is that emotional response that gets you ready for that what we are still carrying around with us? I like the way the British philosopher Janet Richards put it. She says, if we understand that there are good evolutionary reasons for our wanting people to suffer when they have done direct or indirect harm to us, then we can account for our strong feelings about the appropriateness of retribution without presuming they are a guide to moral truth. We may be able to recognize our retributive feeling as a deep and important aspect of our character and take them seriously to that extent, without endorsing them as a guide to truth, and start rethinking our attitudes towards punishment on that basis. Can we do that? Can we just say, okay, we are retributive, we have that in us. Can we get behind it? Would it be good? Does the system work without retribution and so forth? And the power of this determinism idea is caught in the law's excuses, of course, because to blame a person, as Sanford Kaddish put it, to blame a person is to express moral criticism. We're blaming you for doing that act. And if the person's action does not deserve criticism, blaming him is a kind of falsehood, and is the extent the person is injured by being blamed unjust to him. So, how are we going to think about this issue? I think it's what's brewing now in the world culture who thinks about these matters. And where it's going to land, I don't know. Because if you read The Scotsman, which I have been for the last 2 weeks, you will see that all of this is playing out every day in all of our lives. I don't know if you caught this little item in The Scotsman the other day. Top city banker who strangled his unfaithful wife after she asked for a divorce was jailed for 8 years yesterday. Kate Ellerbeck, 46, died after a violent struggle with her husband at their 600,000-pound home in Enfield, North London, in November last year. Neil Lindbergh, 46, was found guilty of manslaughter on grounds of lack of intent by an Old Bailey jury, which cleared him of murder. The judge said, Your frustration erupted that morning when it became clear that your wife was serious about divorce, and it was then that you applied sustained and deliberate pressure to her neck. Wow, that is, forgiveness is seeping into that story there. There is something going on, because I can't imagine that going on in an American court right now. But nonetheless, you get the idea. There's something there. They're letting this guy off, and they've decided in some way that there's other mechanisms involved that should allow for that forgiveness. And here's the opposite outcry after man to serve only 10 years for stabbing dad of 3. This was in paper the other day, Scotsman. Maybe you're familiar with this. Fury erupted yesterday when a man was jailed for life for the knife murder of a member of his extended family. Philip Graham was ordered to serve at least 10 years before he could apply for parole. Pauline Graham, his cousin and the partner of the victim, Mark Johnson, shouted that Graham had given a life sentence to her and her children. The court was furious when the judge only did this 10 years thing. Graham of West Pilton Terrace, Edinburgh, admitted murdering Mr. Johnson, a father of 3, outside his home in Haddington on 14th of June. Earlier that night, following a family engagement party, Mr. Johnson became involved in an argument with Graham's brother, whom he punched. Retribution was sought, and Graham attacked Mr. Johnson on his street near the home. The defense counsel, Mark Stewart, said Graham had been brought up in an environment where violence was used to settle disputes. He was not involved in the original incident and not interested in becoming involved until others encouraged him, said Mr. Stewart. Well, there's this retribution dripping off that story. And so all of these, what I want to convey is that all of these issues that are coming and being generated by, as we come to a more physicalist understanding of who we are going to influence how we think about these issues. Right now, everybody's divided. There's sides, issues on both sides, as you know. And I'm going to, this obviously raises the question, well, can we think about forgiveness and compassion and retribution? And I did have a film clip here of the one your culture had just been through with the Lockerbie bombing, to give the contrast, but I'm going to spare you that right now. And get to the question of is forgiveness a viable concept? Is forgiveness a viable concept? You take the Sermon on the Mount, you take the teachings of Buddha, you take that all together. Is that possible to run a culture, a society, where forgiveness trumps accountability and punishment? Does this system work? People who study computer networks say, if you take accountability out of the network, the whole thing falls apart. Well, no one's saying we take accountability out, but do you need the punishment component? Do you have to have that in there? I think it remains an open question. It's clearly our genome thinks it's important, but can we rise above it or not? I think it all depends on how we come to think about ourselves. So what will it be? Are we going to go the forgiveness route, or are we going to lock them up? Retribution, is it needed for accountability? Is that going to just turn out to be a fact of our lives? And then if we do decide that we have to put people away, and we do, or put them in jail, put them in a hospital, whatever it is, how do we determine what is an appropriate punishment for a particular act? Those are very tough questions, and questions that remain to be studied. So I want to leave you with if I was pulling all together a couple slides where we've been in the last 6 lectures, I want to leave you with this picture and a visual metaphor about it. Of course, we've been talking about how there are all these emergent properties as you go from basic particles up to the mental, up to the social, how those two interact. And this thing is just way too slow. And how that then constrains us and feeds back down into constraining our own actual physiology and behavior. And the notion is that this is a dynamic event going on throughout the whole milieu of our existence. And if I was to try to put this into a visual metaphor, wait a minute, excuse me, this, I went overboard there. If I put it in a visual metaphor, how about this? Here we are in this world of physical forces we all know about, with their consequences for us, their control on our behaviors, and we try to strike out even though we remain the social forces are with us, the physical forces are with us, and we try to strike out to maintain our independence from all of that, as depicted here. That guy just thinks he's getting away. So the way Einstein would have put that situation and the view from determinism is, as he did say, if the moon in the act of completing its eternal way around the earth were gifted in self-consciousness, it would feel thoroughly convinced that it was traveling its way of its own accord. So would a being endowed with higher insight and more perfect intelligence, watching man and his doings, smile about man's illusion that he was acting according to his own free will. Now, okay, that's fine. I mean, that may be a version of saying the interpreter. In the end, I have a different view. I have the view that determinism has really no meaning in the context of human responsibility and choice, that human nature remains constant while behavior can change no matter what the conditions. Humans can follow rules or not, and it is that fact that makes us responsible agents and, yes, free. That's an important and essential fact that I think ultimately is life-affirming and exhilarating. Now, reminded of this cartoon was sent to me by my graduate student when I told him I was going to make these lectures, told him what I was going to say. This cartoon says, if it made sense, that would be a very powerful idea. Graduate students have to keep you honest. Well, maybe a more sober way to put it was William James' way. Our faith is faith in someone else's faith, and in the greatest matters, this is most the case. So through these series of lectures, I've tried to weave a story and tell and pull together a variety of facts and information. But in the end, it is an exercise that, of course, everybody in this room should do for themselves, is interested in it. That's why you're here. And as Donald Mackay used to say, rethink it, and see if you wind up in the same place you did on January as you did the previous January. So I want to take this moment to thank you. It's been a wonderful experience, and I want to also thank the various people here, and I will in a second, who have been such a part of all this research over the years. I'm playing a piece of music, my favorite piece of music, it turns out, but some people say it sounds like a funeral. That's not what I mean. It does signal, however, the end of this terrific experience.
A series of lectures that have been obviously colorfully and carefully prepared with exemplary use of audiovisual materials for those of us who are, I confess, self-confessed dinosaurs in some of the technology, stimulating, thought-provoking, indeed sometimes provocative kinds of claims and issues being put forth, and obviously from the consistency with which you have filled the auditorium, you have succeeded in both eliciting and maintaining an interest in a considerable number of people. So will you join me in once again expressing our appreciation to Professor Gazzaniga for these lectures.
This production is copyright the University of Edinburgh.